Hello, I'm Sonia O'Connor of the University of Bradford, and I specialise in the identification of animal hard tissues worked into cultural objects. And today I'm going to talk to you about bone, antler and ivory. In all periods of human past, materials such as bone, antler and ivory have been worked to produce functional or decorative objects. Some of these materials were almost ubiquitous and chosen for working on the basis of their physical properties for particular practical applications. Other materials might have had more restricted availability, and their use as an indicator of long-term trade and the desire on the part of the individual or society to advertise status or conspicuous wealth. So recognizing which of these materials has been used is important in developing our understanding of the exploitation of animal resources, geographical and political connectivity, and the cultural significance of these objects at particular times in the past. In the collective mind, there is a particular association between Romans and the use of elephant ivory, and this expectation has often led to the misidentification of bone objects as ivory, on the grounds that the object is Roman period and intricately worked, and who would put so much effort into forming or decorating such an obviously high-status object in such an essentially worthless material as bone, which is only butcher's waste after all. These identifications are worse than useless, as they spuriously reinforce the link between Romans and ivory in Roman Britain, and objects that might have been worked locally in the Roman style become either evidence of imported objects or imported raw material. The quality of the carving of an object, its size, surface polish, colour or weight are not reliable characteristics for distinguishing between these materials, as these features can be so greatly altered by the way the material is worked or used and by the burial environment. Chemically, these osseous materials are all very similar, being formed from a collagen protein structure stiffened with a calcium mineral known as bioapatite. Fortunately, the way bone, antler and ivory are grown differ enough that there are structural differences, which should be visible under quite low magnification, that can allow these materials to be identified, sometimes to species level. This immediately allows us to divide them into vascular and non-vascular materials. Vascular materials, such as bone and antler, have a blood supply running through them, and the patterns of dots and lines that these produce on worked surfaces can sometimes even be seen by eye. Ivories are non-vascular, as the blood supply that transports the resources to form the teeth is external to the tissue itself. So, let's look at bone and antler first. Most objects are made from material cut from the shaft of long bones, which is highly organized material. Long bones are essentially a tube of bone with an articular surface at either end. Each bone has a characteristic shape, and so is the center of the bone a characteristic shape as well. This hollow is never, ever perfectly circular. Here's another one, very flattened and has a little septum in the center. And up towards the end of the bone, you'll see spongy tissue. The sides of the bone shaft are often cut up to produce the material for the objects. This is a crochet hook, and it has been worked from bone. And I think you can see, even by eye, the dots and dashes of the blood system where dirt from the hand has highlighted their position. These structures aren't always so obvious, and mostly we have to take a hand lens and look closely at an object under the light, ideally at a microscope, but a hand lens is often enough to show you these details on the object. And now we can actually see the dots and dashes that make up the blood system that's running up and down the bone parallel to the shaft of the long bone it was cut from. When we look at archaeological material, this evidence is often very obvious. we can see in this handle that the hollow in the centre is not circular, it's a natural bone cavity. And in the surface of the bone, we can see the blood vessels running parallel to the long axis of the bone, which is parallel, in this case, to the handle itself. And when we look at the end section, we can see that the bone has been laid down in concentric layers around the cavity in the centre in quite an organised manner. It's the same with this object. Even though the surface has been highly worked and polished, we can see all the structures of the blood vessels in the surface, and you can see that the cavity is not circular and it is unworked. And we're beginning to see some of the spongy tissue here, which we see in the end of the bone at this point in the handle. Antler is, of course, just a special form of bone. It is adapted to withstand impact rather than steady loading, and it grows exceptionally quickly, being formed and shed in less than a year. When we compare the beam of an antler with material from a long bone shaft, there are several key differences. To begin with, the beam of the antler isn't hollow, it's filled with a spongy tissue. And you'll notice too that the surface has a very different texture to bone. And that's because both of these areas are filled with blood vessels, bringing material to the antler for this very rapid growth. And when we look at the compact tissue around that spongy centre, the structures are not laid down in concentric layers as we see in bone. It's rather different. The base of the antler often has spongy tissue which is being refilled with bony material so that the antler can be shed. It cuts off the blood supply before the antler is lost from the skull. Looking at a worked object, we can see the spongy tissue. Even though this has had holes bored in it, it's quite clear that the whole of the centre of this antler tine had spongy tissue in it. And when we look close up at the surface with our lens, we should be able to see that the blood vessels, although lying parallel to the long axis of the tine, are not in discrete straight lines running up and down it, but they merge and separate and merge again in quite a sort of frantic way. The term ivory is often used as a shorthand for elephant ivory, but this can be very misleading. Ivory is dentine, the material of the main body of a tooth. Most teeth are rather small to be worked into objects, but the large, continuously growing teeth or tusks of mammals, such as sperm whale, walrus and hippopotamus, all present substantial quantities of dentine for artifact production. Walrus ivory is particularly associated with the Viking and early medieval periods, but sperm whale ivory has a long record of use in the British Isles, as far back as the Bronze Age at least. And this and hippo ivory from Egypt could potentially be found amongst material of Roman date. Sadly, time only allows us to look at elephant ivory in detail. This is a section of an elephant tusk. If you can imagine, the tusk is running this way, and the end of the tusk that was embedded in the jaw was down here. When we turn it round, you can see it's been sectioned in half, and we can see this groove up the centre, this tapering groove, which is the centre of the tooth where the blood vessels and other nerves and things would have been. And the ivory is laid down in very fine layers over this surface as the tusk grows. With elephant ivory, the organisation of this material produces a very characteristic pattern, known as the Schrager pattern, which you can see here as curving lines crisscrossing over and producing dark and light lozenge shapes. And when we look in the longitudinal section, we can see at the end of these lozenges, lines running down in the surface of the material, and they all reflect the light very differently. And this is called the Schrager pattern on the transverse section, and this is its longitudinal expression in this section here. If we see this, we know we've got elephant ivory. This crisscrossing pattern is not seen in anything other than elephant or mammoth ivory. But it doesn't always show. Here's an example where it shows extremely well. The dark and light hatching here on this object is the Schrager pattern in transverse section. And this is a little Victorian piece. On this knife handle, however, the crisscross pattern would be on this curved surface at the top. I can see quite well with my lights and my lens, I can see the longitudinal expression of the Schrager pattern, these lines that come and go in the surface. And when I turn the end upwards and rotate it in the light, I can see the Schrager pattern becoming more and less obvious as I rotate it. This is a reflection of the light that is being caused by the organisation of the material itself. When we come to archaeological material, things can be very different. On this particular piece, staining of the ivory has actually made the Schrager pattern fairly obvious, particularly the longitudinal striations. But in other archaeological pieces, it isn't obvious at all. However, elephant ivory does crack along the thin layers of the dentine, the cone within cone structure that forms over the pulp cavity. And sometimes when it breaks, you'll see that it has broken along these curved lines. And that's a very characteristic section of elephant ivory that is deteriorated. In this archaeological object, we can see many of the same features that have become more obvious due to the deterioration of the object. On this surface, we can see cracks running longitudinally, which are formed between groups of the fine lamellae of the dentine itself. This surface is one of those concentric cracks which has opened up and a piece of the object has come away, and that is quite curved, that surface. On this external work surface, we can still see some of the major cracks that are running down between the layers of the dentine. But unfortunately, on the ends, we really can't see the Schrager pattern, except under magnification and the light again, we can begin to see some of the structures that we want to see to be sure that this was ivory. Time has only allowed me to give a very superficial coverage of this topic, but I hope it will be enough to give you the confidence to look more closely at your finds and create a better understanding of the use of ivory in Romano British society.